Welcome to the Ubuntu Institute of Ideas, your gateway to Africa's politics, economy, and global influence. Rooted in the profound philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are, this platform amplifies Africa's voice and reimagines its place in a rapidly evolving world. Today's episode, Africa Demands 2 Permanent Seats at the UN Security Council, tackles one of the most pressing debates of our time. Can an institution shaped by the aftermath of World War II truly address the complexities of the 21st century? How can the UN Security Council claim legitimacy when a continent as vast and pivotal as Africa remains excluded from permanent representation? We'll explore the compelling case for reform, from addressing historical injustices to ensuring African perspectives are central to global decision-making. But the path isn't without challenges. Veto power, representation, and geopolitical maneuvering all come into play. This conversation isn't just about Africa, it's about the future of global governance and equity. Stay tuned as we dissect the stakes, navigate the controversies, and uncover what's next for Africa on the global stage.
All right, everyone, get ready, because today we are diving deep into a really hot topic at the UN.
Oh, yeah.
Africa's push for permanent seats on the Security Council.
It's been all over the place.
It has. It's been in all these high-level debates lately.
Absolutely.
And even the UN Secretary General himself is weighing in on this.
Yep.
We've got a really fascinating mix of sources for this one. We've got UN press releases, we've got think tank reports, we've got news articles.
Wow.
We've even got a video of Kofi Annan to give us some historical perspective.
Nice.
So we're going to break it all down for you. We're going to break down Africa's arguments for inclusion,
Yeah.
what the obstacles are to getting these seats,
Right.
and what a potential shake-up of the Security Council might actually look like.
I think it's a really fascinating debate.
It is.
It goes way beyond just adding a few chairs to the table. It gets to the heart of how decisions are made on the world stage, like global power dynamics.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's rewind the clock a bit. So the Security Council, as we know it,
Right.
was formed way back in 1945, right after World War II.
Yeah, that's right.
But here's the thing. Most of Africa was still under colonial rule at that time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That historical context is really key to understanding the demands that Africa is making now.
Okay.
The very structure of the Security Council with its 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, is a reflection of what the power dynamics were like in 1945.
Yeah.
Which was a world where most African nations had no voice at all on international affairs.
Right. So when you think about it, it's pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Because Africa contributes so much to UN peacekeeping missions.
They do.
More than half of the top 20 contributors are African states.
It's incredible.
But they have no permanent seat at the table when it comes to making decisions about global security issues that directly impact them.
Yeah, that's a huge point of the argument, right?
Yeah.
How can the UN really be effective
Right,
and legitimate?
Yeah.
In addressing global challenges, if such a large and influential continent is systematically excluded from permanent representation.
Right. It really makes you wonder if the Security Council is truly representative of the world today.
Totally.
Okay, so enough of the history lesson for now.
Okay.
Let's talk about what Africa is specifically asking for.
So they have a unified position on this, which is really interesting.
Okay.
And it was outlined in 2 key documents back in 2005, the Izolini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration.
Okay.
And essentially, the African Union, or the AU, is demanding 2 permanent seats with full veto power,
Wow.
plus 2 additional non-permanent seats.
So they're not just asking for a voice, they're asking for an equal voice,
Exactly.
complete with the power to veto decisions.
Exactly. They want real power.
That's a bold demand.
It is.
And you said it was a united front.
It is, yeah. The entire continent is behind these demands.
So all of Africa is standing together on this.
Absolutely.
Wow. To give you a sense of how strongly they feel about this, I want to share a really powerful statement from Sierra Leone's President Bayo.
Okay.
He actually spoke on behalf of the African Union at a recent UN debate,
Right.
and he said, and this is a direct quote, "Africa wants the veto abolished."
Wow.
However, he continued, if UN member states wish to retain the veto, it must extend it to all new permanent members as a matter of justice.
That's powerful.
Talk about cutting to the chase,
Well,
right?
yeah, no messing around.
They're not mincing words here.
No.
But what's been the global reaction to this?
Well, it's getting interesting.
Okay.
The US, UK, and France have all expressed some level of support for African representation.
Okay, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
So we might actually see some movement on this.
We might, but there are caveats.
Oh,
For
okay.
example, the US supports giving Africa 2 permanent seats,
Okay.
but without veto power.
Okay.
They've also indicated support for seats for Germany, India, and Japan, and a South American country. But notably not Brazil.
Wait, why not Brazil?
That's a good question.
That is really interesting.
And why these specific countries?
It feels like there's a bigger strategy going on here.
There very well could be. We can't ignore the rising influence of China and Russia in Africa.
Right.
And, it's possible the U.S. sees Security Council reform as a way to try to counter that.
Okay.
In fact, there was a recent youth survey, and 77% of African youth identified China as the most important nation for Africa's future.
77%.
Yeah, not the U.S.
Wow, that's pretty stark.
It is.
It seems like the whole global power dynamic is shifting,
It is.
and the old guard might be feeling a bit of pressure here.
Absolutely. And this whole debate over UN Security Council reform,
Yeah.
it's right at the center of that shift. It highlights this growing demand for a more inclusive and representative system of global governance.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. But okay, so we've got support for reform.
Right.
But it seems to come with a lot of strings attached.
It does.
So what are the main roadblocks to actually making this happen?
Well, amending the UN Charter, it's not a walk in the park.
Nope.
To make any changes, you need a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly,
Okay.
including the approval of all 5 permanent members.
The infamous veto power rears its head again.
Exactly.
But do you really think any of those permanent members would actually be willing to give up that power?
That's a very good question.
And if not, how can we break this deadlock?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It seems very unlikely that they would relinquish their veto power entirely.
Right.
I mean, it's too valuable a tool on the world stage.
Of course.
But France has actually floated an interesting idea,
Oh.
which is limiting veto use in cases of mass atrocities.
Interesting.
But whether that gains any traction remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's a glimmer of hope, at least.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so even if we manage to overcome that hurdle,
Yeah.
we still have another big question to tackle.
Yeah.
Which countries actually get those permanent seats?
That's where it gets even more complicated. Choosing Africa's representatives is a whole continental conundrum all on its own.
Yeah.
Should it be based on a nation's size or economic power or their contributions to the UN?
Right.
Or should there be a rotating system or maybe an African Union body holding the seat?
Oh, wow. So many possibilities.
Right.
If you are in charge of designing this whole system, what would you do?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
And it's a question we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Welcome back to our deep dive into Africa's ambitions for permanent representation on the UN Security Council.
You know, it's interesting as we're unpacking all of this, those statements from African leaders we discussed earlier really stick with me.
Yeah, they're really powerful.
They're not just politely asking for a seat at the table.
No, not at all.
It's a call to action.
It is, yeah.
Born out of decades of frustration with a system that many see as inherently unfair.
Absolutely. And it's not just about symbolism either. They want a real impact on decisions that shape the world, particularly when it comes to issues that directly impact the African continent.
Exactly. So this debate goes beyond just Africa, right?
It does, yeah.
It makes us think about some fundamental questions about the future of global governance.
It really does.
Can an institution that was designed in the aftermath of World War II,
Right.
with all of its inherent power imbalances,
Yeah.
can it truly reflect the realities of today's multipolar world?
It's a big question.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah,
Back in 1945, the balance of power looked very different.
right.
The current structure of the Security Council, with its 5 permanent members holding veto power, It feels like a relic of a bygone era.
It does. It raises questions about whether the system is even equipped to handle the complexities of the 21st century.
Yeah.
This push for African representation goes beyond just adding a few seats.
Right.
It challenges the very foundations of global decision-making. Like, who sets the agenda? Who defines what a threat to international peace and security even is?
Right.
And who gets to decide what actions to take?
So we're talking about a potential paradigm shift.
Potentially, yeah.
In how global power is, like, distributed and wielded.
Exactly. There are definitely strong voices out there arguing that the current system just perpetuates a global hierarchy.
Right.
Where certain countries have a disproportionate amount of influence,
Right.
while others are basically left on the sidelines.
Yeah, and of course, you've got those who defend the status quo.
Oh, yeah.
They argue that it provides stability, that it prevents chaos on the world stage.
That's the argument, yeah.
But both sides have valid points.
They do. That's what makes this debate so interesting.
That's what we're here for.
Absolutely.
The deep dive is here to help you navigate all those nuances.
That's right.
But let's step back from the, philosophical arguments for a moment.
Okay.
Let's get back to the practicalities of all of this.
All right.
Even if we grant that reform is, morally and geopolitically necessary, how can it actually be achieved?
Well, amending the UN Charter is a monumental task, let me tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, it requires a supermajority vote in the General Assembly,
Okay.
including the consent of all 5 permanent members.
Oh, there it is again.
Yep, that veto power.
Realistically, do you think any of them would actually be willing to surrender that veto power?
It's hard to imagine. I mean, it's like asking them to give up their most valuable weapon.
Yeah, why would they ever agree to that?
Well, I mean, it comes down to power dynamics, right?
Right.
The permanent members benefit from the current system,
Okay.
but that doesn't mean that change is impossible.
Oh, okay.
There are a few scenarios that could potentially lead to reform.
Okay, I'm listening. What are they?
One possibility is just like a massive groundswell of support
Okay.
from a large enough block of countries.
Okay.
If the vast majority of UN member states demand change,
Right.
it becomes harder and harder for the permanent 5 to just ignore those demands.
Strength in numbers, the classic David versus Goliath scenario.
Exactly. The permanent members might be reluctant to relinquish their veto power completely,
Right.
but they might be open to, limiting its use
Yeah.
or exploring alternative decision-making mechanisms.
Okay.
Like perhaps a system where a veto can be overridden by a supermajority vote, for example.
So a more nuanced approach
Right.
where, absolute power is tempered by collective decision-making.
Exactly. Instead of a sudden radical overhaul,
Right.
we might see a more gradual evolution
Okay.
towards a more representative and equitable system.
I like that.
Yeah, that's one potential path.
Okay.
Another scenario involves a major global crisis,
Oh, okay.
perhaps a pandemic on a scale we haven't seen before,
Wow.
or a large-scale conflict with, global ramifications.
Right.
Such an event could create a sense of urgency
Yeah.
and shared purpose that compels the international community to really rethink the existing structures of global governance.
So a crisis as a catalyst for change.
Exactly. It's not unheard of.
No, it's not.
World War II led to the creation of the UN in the first place.
Right.
Out of the ashes of conflict, a new world order emerged.
Exactly. And as we face all these increasingly complex challenges,
We do.
from climate change to the threat of nuclear proliferation,
Yeah,
the need for global cooperation just becomes even more important, more critical.
absolutely.
A crisis could force nations to put aside their differences
That could.
and really work together for the common good,
And flee.
even if it means rethinking long-held assumptions about, power and sovereignty.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's assume for a moment that reform does happen
Okay,
against all odds.
all right.
We've touched on the question of who gets those African seats.
Yeah.
But what would a reformed Security Council actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
How would it function differently?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
There are a lot of different models for reform being proposed,
Right.
each with its own set of, advantages and disadvantages.
Okay.
One popular idea is just expanding the number of permanent and non-permanent seats
Okay.
to give greater representation to regions like Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Okay, so more voices, more perspectives, more representation.
Right. On the surface, it sounds like a step in the right direction.
It does.
But then the question becomes, how do you select those new members?
Right.
What criteria do you even use?
Right.
Population size,
Yeah.
economic power, military might.
Right.
contributions to UN peacekeeping missions.
Oh, man.
It gets really complicated really quickly.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded.
Pretty much, yeah. So it's not as simple as just adding more chairs to the table.
No, not at all.
And some reform proposals go even beyond just adding seats.
Okay.
They call for changes to the veto power itself.
Okay.
For example, some have suggested limiting veto power to specific types of decisions,
Okay.
such as those involving the use of military force.
So instead of having an absolute veto, you'd
Okay.
have a more nuanced system. Exactly.
Where certain decisions could be made even without unanimous consent.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Others have gone even further and proposed to abolish the veto power altogether.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, they argue that it's inherently undemocratic
Right.
and that it gives too much power to a select few countries.
There would be a radical shift.
It would fundamentally change the power dynamics of the Security Council.
Yeah, wow.
But it's an idea that's gaining traction in some circles.
Interesting.
Another intriguing proposal is to create a new category of semi-permanent members.
Okay.
These members would serve longer terms than the current non-permanent members,
Okay.
but wouldn't have veto power.
So a middle ground
Right.
between the permanent members with their absolute veto
Yeah.
and the non-permanent members with their limited influence.
It could be a way to give greater voice to emerging powers without fundamentally altering the power dynamics of the Security Council.
It's acknowledging the shifting global landscape without completely upending the existing order.
So we've got expanding the council,
Right.
limiting the veto, abolishing the veto,
Yeah.
creating new categories of membership. It's a lot.
It is, and we haven't even touched on some of the other proposed reforms, like changing the voting procedures or making the Security Council more transparent and accountable to the wider UN membership.
Right.
There's a real appetite for reform out there.
It seems like it.
But the specifics are still very much up for debate.
Yeah, finding a solution that satisfies everyone,
Yeah.
or at least a large enough majority to actually enact change,
Right.
is going to require some serious diplomacy and compromise.
It will.
Like a high-stakes game of global chess,
It is.
with the future of global governance hanging in the balance.
And it's a game that's being played out right now
Yeah.
in real time with real consequences for people all over the world.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Africa's quest for permanent representation on the UN Security Council.
Yeah. It's been a fascinating conversation so far.
It has, and we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
The history, the arguments, and the potential models for reform.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but now let's bring it all home.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the Security Council as this incredibly powerful body, like kind of the ultimate decision maker when it comes to global peace and security.
They have a lot of power.
But why should all of this matter to our listener?
You know, I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Because we hear about all these high-level diplomatic discussions,
Right.
but it can be hard to really connect them to our everyday lives.
Totally. So break it down for us.
Okay.
How does this debate about UN reform actually impact the world outside the halls of the UN?
Well, think about the conflicts that we're seeing all over the headlines, like the war in Ukraine,
Right.
the ongoing crisis in Gaza, the instability in the Sahel region.
Yeah.
These are all situations that land squarely on the Security Council's agenda. They have the power to impose sanctions,
Right.
authorize military interventions, deploy peacekeeping forces.
Wow.
So their decisions have real consequences
Yeah.
for people on the ground,
Yeah.
shaping the course of these conflicts.
Right.
And really impacting the lives of millions of people.
So who sits at that table?
Yeah.
Who gets to voice their perspective? Who gets to influence those decisions?
Right.
It really matters.
It does. It's not just some abstract diplomatic game.
No.
And for Africa, a continent that is often disproportionately impacted by conflict
Right.
and poverty and climate change,
Yeah.
having a permanent voice in those discussions is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
It's about ensuring that African perspectives are heard,
Right.
that African interests are taken into account,
Okay.
and that African solutions are part of the equation.
So it's about more than just fairness or representation.
Yeah.
You're saying that a more inclusive Security Council
Right.
could actually lead to more effective solutions to global crises.
That's the argument. Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Because when you have a wider range of voices and perspectives at the table,
Yeah.
you're less likely to fall into the trap of groupthink.
Right, you get different ideas, you get different solutions.
Exactly. You're more likely to consider a variety of approaches and come up with solutions that are more nuanced, that take into account the complexities of the local context.
So it's like having a more diverse team
Yeah.
working on a project, right? Like the more perspectives you bring in, the more creative and innovative your solutions are likely to be.
Absolutely. And when it comes to global peace and security, we need all the brainpower and ingenuity we can get.
That's true.
It's not just about giving Africa a seat at the table.
Yeah.
It's about making the table itself more effective
Right.
in tackling the challenges that we face as a global community.
All right, I'm convinced
Right.
a more representative Security Council seems like a win-win.
It does.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay.
What about the arguments against reform? What are the potential downsides here?
Well, one concern that's often raised is that expanding the Security Council
Yeah.
would make it just too unwieldy,
Right.
too bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Adding more members could slow down decision-making,
Right.
make it harder to reach consensus,
Okay.
especially in times of crisis when you really need to act quickly.
Right. So instead of a streamlined,
Right.
decisive body, you risk creating a slow-moving, bureaucratic behemoth.
Yeah, that's the worry.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the current system is already pretty dysfunctional.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, we've seen countless examples of the Security Council being paralyzed by gridlock,
Right.
unable to take decisive action because of that veto power.
Right.
So sometimes having too few voices can be just as problematic as having too many.
It's a tricky balance for sure.
It is, yeah.
How do you ensure representation and inclusivity
Right.
without sacrificing efficiency and effectiveness?
Well, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. The goal of reform shouldn't be to create a perfect system,
Yeah.
but to create a better one.
Okay.
A system that's more representative,
Right.
more just,
Okay.
and more capable of addressing the complex challenges of the 21st century,
Yeah.
even if it means some messy compromises along the way.
Right. Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive.
Wow.
We've unpacked the history,
Yeah.
the arguments, the potential roadblocks, the various models for reform.
Lots of models.
It's a complex issue
It is.
with no easy answers.
No.
But as we wrap up, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important message is that we all have a stake in this.
Okay.
The debate about UN Security Council reform is a chance to rethink how power is distributed on the global stage,
Yeah.
how decisions are made,
Okay.
and how we can work together to create a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.
Right.
Don't let the complexities discourage you.
Yeah.
Stay informed,
Okay.
stay engaged,
Right.
and keep asking those tough questions.
That's good advice.
Thank you.
You know, the deep dive is all about giving you the knowledge and insights you need
Absolutely.
to keep exploring these issues on your own.
Yeah, we want you to keep digging deeper.
Keep digging deeper, keep demanding a world that reflects our shared values of fairness, justice, and cooperation.
We can do it.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.
As we conclude, we extend heartfelt gratitude to our panelists for their illuminating insights on this urgent and complex issue. The call for UNSC reform is not just a plea for fairness, it is a rallying cry for justice, legitimacy, and the future of global governance. Today, we've peeled back the layers of history, law, and ethics that underpin Africa's underrepresentation, delving into the promises and pitfalls of a reimagined Security Council. The challenges are immense: veto power, inter-African unity, and the very essence of equitable representation. Yet, these challenges present an opportunity, a chance to reshape the structures of power for a more inclusive and just world. This conversation leaves us with profound questions that demand bold answers. Can we build a UNSC that truly serves humanity, not just entrenched power? How can Africa rise above internal divisions to claim its rightful place at the table? Will the voices of civil society and global citizens be loud enough to hold leaders accountable? The answers to these questions are not just Africa's, they are the world's. The path forward is not easy, but it is necessary. The future of peace, equity, and global stability hinges on this fight for representation. Thank you for tuning in to the Ubuntu Institute of Ideas. Share this episode, spark discussions, and join the movement to amplify Africa's voice. Together, we're not just imagining a better world, we're building it. It starts now, and it starts with you. Stay connected. Follow the Ubuntu Institute of Ideas for more transformative conversations. Like, share, and spread this episode to amplify Africa's voice and drive change across borders.